Well, good evening, everybody. How we doing? Spectre here on the 5x5 channel for a little fireside action here tonight. Good to have you aboard. Waiting to get all the various streams up here. Still waiting on the D-Live side, so bear with me a minute here as we get that sorted out. But if you're over on the Twitch side, good to have you aboard. YouTube's up. We're running there. Over on Periscope as well. And of course, our friends over on the Foxhole app, build.net. If you're joining over there, good to have you aboard on this now the 26th day of March. Boy, where the heck did the month go? And it looks like perhaps D-Live is a little hung up here. Let me try her one more time here before we get going. As always, if you're not familiar with kind of the format and that, you can grab a chair, grab a log, get pulled up, get your favorite beverage of choice, whatever that may be, cold or hot. It's a little bit chilly in my neck of the woods here this evening, so we can sit around the fire and gather around here this evening, as always. So there we go, D-Live finally up and going here. Good to have you guys aboard as well. Alright, so tonight on the broadcast, well, a couple things. Kind of a theme going on here tonight, and the theme is this: Leviathan. Remember that word. We're going to touch upon that in a couple articles here tonight. So fasten your seatbelts, like I said, gather around the fire, get your favorite beverage of choice, whether it be cold or hot, whatever it may be. We're going to get going here right now. And so tonight, the first article I'm going to cover is the nuttiness of the world. And of course, well, as is typical, it's officially an offense now to leave England. Now let me repeat that. It's officially an offense now to leave England. Believe that? What sort of bizarre world are we in? It says, are you ready for this week's absurdity? Here's our Friday roll-up of the most ridiculous stories from around the world that are threats to your liberty, risks to your prosperity, and on occasion, inspiring poetic justice. So, it's officially now an offense to leave England. After 4 hours of debate yesterday in the House of Commons, the United Kingdom has approved an emergency measure that will, among other restrictions, fine Brits who leave the country without a qualifying reason. Ironically, the British government insists they can legally impose these new rules because of authority that was granted to them under a law called the Public Health Act, which just happened to be passed in 1984. Oh, you can't make this stuff up, folks. So starting on Monday, anyone who leaves England must submit papers making a certified declaration of their reason for leaving. Yes, of course, your papers, please, folks. The authorities will then retain the discretion to fine travelers £5,000, nearly $7,000, if the reason isn't valid. The government has provided a list of 14 valid excuses, such as a professional football team traveling for a match. This is totally fine. But someone who wants to attend a religious pilgrimage is forbidden to travel. So is someone who wants to visit an elderly parent they haven't seen since 2019, unless it's a parent whom the traveler reasonably believes is dying. How magnanimous. By the way, these new rules come despite members of Parliament acknowledging in debate yesterday that 95% of Britons over the age of 60 have been vaccinated. This means that the most vulnerable population has been administered a vaccine that they insist is safe and effective. So, why the harsh lockdown rules? And I guess to pile onto that before moving on to the next portion of that is Bojo trying to insist that you got to have your papers now, as he was holding a beer in hand, and it looked like there was a mass uprising against that based on what I saw here in the feeds and that here today as well. So English folks, not Brits, you English folks over there across the pond, you guys got your work cut out for you. I think a little revolution is in the air, don't you think? Tell these people to pound fricking sand. New York crowd cheers blind obedience to public health officials. Well, probably not all that surprised. Tracy Edwards, a New York Public Service Commission appointee, appeared with New York Governor Cuomo last week to encourage total ignorance and unquestioning loyalty to the public health officials. While encouraging people to take the vaccine, Edwards said, "I'm not asking what's in the infusion. I'm not looking up all of the ingredients in the infusion. I am sticking out my arm and I am taking the infusion. And that's what we have to do." The crowd cheered in approval. This is what the public is being sold. Don't read any of the research and make up your own mind. Don't have a conversation with your doctor to make an informed medical decision. Don't take even a moment to weigh potential costs and benefits. Instead, you should be deliberately ignorant and happily do exactly what the public health overlords tell you, without question. These are the same New York public health officials who, by the way, sent sick patients into nursing homes, killed countless people, and then covered it up. Obey. You get that, folks? This is what they want. An obedient populace. Old Carlin's stand-up comedy unfortunately comes to mind as I read through that, and for whatever reason, as I got to the part of the crowd cheered in approval, it kind of reminds me of the blind clapping in that you see on South Park. The jumping up and down of folks in that always clapping in obedience. That's what you want. What they want is an obedient populace, folks. They don't want you thinking. They want you just smart enough to push the buttons. That's it. California couple can't move into their home because of eviction moratorium. A couple paid the owner of a home in California $560,000 in cash in January 2020. But that owner is still living inside the home today. He has been able to take advantage of California's COVID eviction moratorium to pocket the cash and continue living in the home rent-free. It's hard to understand how the law could possibly apply to this situation, but the couple's legal proceedings to take possession of their home have been stalled due to the ban on evicting tenants. Just to be clear, this isn't the tenant of the former owner. It is the former owner himself who refuses to leave. Who would have thought that anyone would take advantage of California's ridiculous laws? Insane is what it is. And of course, you can now receive a Bachelor of Tolerance and Coexistence degree. Oy. More ridiculousness. Why do we have institutions for higher learning at this point? Can we even really call them institutions of higher learning? Is a college degree really worth anything at this point? Is it just continued indoctrination as the first 12, 13 years of your life going through school? I hope people wake up. A university in the United Arab Emirates has introduced a Bachelor of Tolerance and Coexistence degree. The 3-year program offered by Mohammed bin Zayed University for Humanities is the first of its kind in the world. The university chancellor says the degree, quote, develops students' understanding and respect for different cultures, civilizations, and religions, so they can act as ambassadors and build bridges of communication between cultures and civilizations, end quote. Of course, graduates should probably start their work in the UAE, a country where homosexuality or any perceived blasphemy against Islam can be punishable by imprisonment or even death. So, but hey, coexistence and tolerance. In any case, let's move on. That is some of the ridiculousness going on around the world. I'm sure there's a lot more. It's just the nature of where we find ourselves in this day and age. So, like I said, to lead things off here this evening, Leviathan is going to kind of be the theme. Interesting article out of Strategic Culture Foundation. Leviathan mobilizes for decisive battle. Good read by Alistair Crook here, dating back a couple weeks ago now. It's been a little bit since we had one of these, so I got a little bit of a backlog of articles and that to get to for these firesides. So, globalist forces are being mobilized to win a last battle in the long war, looking to break through everywhere. In The Revolt of the Public, Martin Gurry, a former CIA analyst, contends that Western elites are experiencing a collapse of authority, deriving from a failure to distinguish between legitimate criticism and what he terms illegitimate rebellion. Once control over the justifying myth of America was lost, the mask was off, and the disparity between the myth and public experience of it became only too evident. Writing in 2014, Gurry foresaw that the establishment would respond by denouncing all evidence of public discontent as lies and disinformation. The establishment would, in Gurry's telling, be so constrained within their bubble that they would be unable to assimilate their loss of monopoly over their own confected reality. This establishment denial would be made manifest, he argued, in a delusional, ham-fisted authoritarian manner. His predictions have been vindicated, with Trumpist dissidents denounced as a threat to our democracy amidst a media and social platform crackdown. Such a response would only confirm the suspicions of the public, thus setting off a vicious circle of yet more distrust and loss of legitimacy, Gurry concluded. And boy howdy, I think he pretty well nailed it, because we are exactly there. Says this was Gurry's main thrust. The book's striking feature, however, was how it seemed so completely to nail the coming Trump and Brexit era, and the anti-system impulse behind them. In America, this impulse found Trump, not the other way around. The point here essentially being that America no longer saw red and blue as the two extended wings belonging to the bird of liberal democracy. For something around half of America, the system was rigged towards a profiteering 0.1% and against them. The key point here, surely, is whether the elite's great reset to reinvent themselves as leaders of the revamped values of liberalism, overlaid by a newly updated AI and robot-led post-modernity, is destined to succeed or not. Continued westification of the globe, the principal component to old liberal globalism, though tarnished and largely discredited, remains mandatory, as made clear in the cogent reasoning recently advanced by Robert Kagan. Absent the justifying myth of seeding democracy across the world, which, to organize the empire, the moral logic of the entire enterprise begins to fall apart. Kagan argued, with surprising frankness. He thus asserts that the U.S. empire abroad is required, precisely in order to preserve the myth of democracy at home. An America that retreats from global hegemony, he argues, would no longer possess the cohesive binding to preserve America as liberal democracy at home either. Gurry is ambivalent on the elite's ability to stick fast. He both asserts that the center cannot hold, but then adds that the periphery had no clue what to do about it. The public revolts would likely arrive unattached to coherent plans, pushing society into interminable cycles of zero-sum clashes between myopic authorities and their increasingly furious subjects. He calls this a paralysis of distrust, where outsiders can neutralize but not replace the center, and networks can protest and overthrow but never govern. There may indeed be some truth in this latter observation. Yet, what is happening today in the U.S. is but one battle, albeit a key one. A longer strategic war reaching far back. The notion of a new world order is nothing new. Imagined by globalists today, as before, it remains a teleological process of the westification of the globe. Western universal values pursued under the rubric of scientific modernism. What sets the Great Reset apart, however, is that it is a later, more updated version of Western values, not the same Western values as they were yesterday. The reek of colonialism has been exorcised from the imperial project through the launch of war on white supremacy and on racial and social injustice. Global leadership has been recast as saving the planet from climate change, saving all humanity from the pandemic, and safeguarding us all from a coming global financial crisis. Mother's milk, who would resist such a well-intentioned agenda? The current Great Reset is a process of metamorphosis, a change in Western values and paradigm. As Professor Dugan writes, and this is important, it is a double process to update the West itself, and, at the same time, to project an updated version to the world beyond. This is a kind of postmodern combination of the Western and the modern. But its essence, the root to this metahistorical struggle, always has been the world order, open society focus on disembedding humans from all forms of collective identity. Firstly, to disembed Renaissance man from his notion of being a microcosm, interpenetrating within a vast surrounding, living macrocosm, this aim being largely achieved via the advent of empirical scientism. Then the decoupling from Latin Catholicism via Protestant individualism, and lately, liberation from the secular nation-state through globalism. And finally, we reach the shedding late stage, the severance from all collective identities and histories, including ethnicity and gender, both now to be self-defined. It is the passage to a new kind of liberalism, one that sweeps gender and identity into full liquid fluidity. This latter aspect is not some secondary, accessory, or add-on. It is something essentially embedded within the logic of liberalism. The logic is inescapable, and the ultimate logical end to which it leads, well, to the disembedding of the subjective self into transhumanism. But let's not go there. It is dark. In effect, being human is to impose the subjective on the objective. We need to liberate the objects from the subjects, from humanity, and explore the things as they are, without man, without being a tool of man. And here, Gary's insight is salient. The plan is out of control and becoming progressively more bizarre. The American unipolar moment is done. It has created oppositions of various kinds, both abroad and at home. Conservative and traditional impulses have reacted against the radical ideological agenda. And crucially, the 2008 financial crisis and near collapse of the system foretold to the elites of the ultimate coming end to the U.S. financial hegemony and concomitantly, to America's primacy. It forced a critical juncture. Now, they are at a crucial impasse. When they speak about reset, this means a forced return to the continuation of the agenda. But it is not as straightforward as it seems. Everything seemed almost primed to fall into place 20 years ago. Yet now, the establishment is having to fight for every element of this strategy because, everywhere they encounter a growing resistance. And it is no insignificant resistance. In America alone, some 74 million Americans reject the cultural war being waged on them. Fyodor Dostoevsky described in The Demons the consequence to all the severance from meaning as discovered at the deepest levels of the collective human psyche. Transcendence? You can't just be rid of it. Yearning for meaning, for knowing who we are, is hardwired into the human psyche. In The Demons, its denial and rejection leads only to warped violence, including child rape, wanton destruction, and other extreme pathological behavior. Dostoevsky originally envisioned demons as a political polemic, but horrified by news reports of a Russian nihilist leader's orchestration of a pointless political murder. Dostoevsky fictionalized the story, hoping to shed light on how the sensitive, genteel, well-meaning Russian secular liberals of the 1840s had prepared the way for their 1860s generation of radicalized, ideology-maddened children bent on tearing down the world. In a sense, Dostoevsky's exploration of the psychology of secular liberal Russians in the 1840s, who passed on their criticisms of the establishment to the next generation, were somehow forerunners to the Woodstock generation of the 1960s, of easygoing, spoiled youth in search for meaning and transcendence, from boring reality through music, sex, and drugs. Both produced angry children driven by hate towards a world conspiring constantly to frustrate their vision of how things should be. If asked why Western culture has been trapped in an oscillating dynamic between liberalism and nihilistic radicalism for roughly 2 centuries with no end in sight, Dostoevsky would probably answer that is because of our disembedding from the deeper levels of what it means to be human. This loss inevitably creates pathologies. Carl Jung came to the same view. So, will the reset be realized? The elites still cling to Westernization. America is back, although no one is greatly enthused. The obstacles are many and growing. Obstacles and crises at home, where Biden visibly is shedding authority. U.S. decision-making seemingly lacks a chair, or shall we say, a functioning ringmaster. Who is in charge of foreign policy? It is opaque, and America itself is irreconcilably split and weakened. But also, for the first time, the U.S. and EU are increasingly seen abroad to be inept at managing the most simple of affairs. Nonetheless, the globalist call to arms is evident. The world clearly has changed during the last 4 years. Globalist forces, therefore, are being mobilized to win a last battle in the long war, looking to break through everywhere. Defeating Trump is the first goal. Discrediting all varieties of European populism is another. The U.S. thinks to lead the maritime and rimland powers in imposing a searing psychological, technological, and economic defeat on the Russian-China-Iran alliance. In the past, the outcome might have been predictable. This time, Eurasia may very well stand solid against a weakened Oceania, a faint-hearted Europe. It would shake Leviathan to its foundations. Who knows what might then emerge from the ruins of post-modernity? Interesting read. Trying to get into the old psyche of what it means to be human and all this business of transcendence. And it's interesting because I just got done reading a book that covered some of the similar stuff. The Founding Fathers, Secret Societies, Freemasons, Illuminati, Rosicrucians, and the Decoding of the Great Seal. And Carl Jung, that was just mentioned in that article, had lots to say about you know, the human psyche and what it means to be human, and objective versus subjective, and it's enough to make your head spin, but nonetheless, it is worth a read. So I would encourage you, if you've never had an opportunity, you can actually find that over on archive.org and actually check it out too. That being said, I will drop the link for those interested in the articles as we go along here this evening. So let me go ahead and get that out there into chat for you guys. That is the one that I just got done reading out of Strategic Culture right there. Let's see, we have got this little nugget out of the Burning Platform. And this is going to be a two-part series here by Jim Quinn over on his blog site, the Burning Platform here. It's called Who is Shaking the Jar? And like I said, it's going to be a two-parter here, a little bit of a long read. So let me get a swig here behind the scenes and we'll get going. That's better. Alright, so it says if you catch 100 red fire ants, as well as 100 large black ants, and put them in a jar, at first nothing will happen. However, if you violently shake the jar and dump them back on the ground, the ants will fight until they eventually kill each other. The thing is, the red ants think the black ants are the enemy, and vice versa, when in reality, the real enemy is a person who shook the jar. This is exactly what's happening in society today. Liberal versus conservative. Black versus white. Pro-mask versus anti-mask. Vax versus anti-vax. Rich versus poor. Man versus woman. Cop versus citizen. The real question we need to be asking ourselves is who is shaking the jar and why? Quote by Shira Starr. A few weeks ago, I saw the above quote in Jeff Thomas's article, Learning from Ants, and it has been reverberating in my mind ever since. It is a perfect analogy for what has been happening in this country for years, with the jar lately being shaken at a rate faster than a Biden vote count increase at 3 a.m. in a swing state. Everyone in this country, and the world, is at each other's throats. Who is shaking the jar? Why are they shaking the jar? Why do they want us fighting each other? I think we probably already know the answer to that. Many of us who have been in this movement and paying attention with eyes wide open for the better part of, I'll say, for at least the last 3 years. Many of us long before that, obviously. We know who the players are. They think, obviously, that we're going to be at each other's throats. No, my neighbor's not my enemy. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, the powers, the spirits of the dark age. We know that. We know who you are. We know who you associate with at the end of the day. Who's paying the dollars to all these folks? Their days are numbered, and they've been found wanting. Keep that in mind. If they keep us focused on fighting each other, they believe we will not notice their reprehensible criminality as they manipulate the masses through psychological engineering and the employment of propaganda techniques to push their desired narrative. If you ask someone who is shaking the jar, they will likely answer based on the standard left versus right, liberal versus conservative, white versus black paradigm, which has been created by those benefiting from conflict. It is always a safe bet to follow the money when trying to identify the culprits. The elevated intensity of manipulation by those pulling the strings of societal discontent reveals much about their level of desperation in creating more chaos, because the awakening of more to the truth endangers their wealth, power, and control. They have turned the shaking power up to 11 in the past year, as an implosion of the Ponzi financial system was looming as we entered 2020, and the deep state oligarchs needed cover to implement a massive injection of liquidity into the veins of Wall Street bankers, the medical industrial complex, and mega corporations like Amazon, Walmart, and Target. and I'll pause right there yet again just to say this, that there is so much liquidity in the system right now. Again, you've heard me talk about this on this channel, my channel, you name it. The Fed pumping out about $160 billion a month. You know, since I think August of 2019, some 3.9 trillion has now been added into the M1 or M2, which is what the measure is for the Fed of actual dollars in circulation. 3.9 trillion, capital T, trillion. And then throw on top of that, folks, $1.9 trillion package passed by Congress. Looking to have another couple, 2-3 trillion in that for some sort of infrastructure package. You know, by the time you add all this stuff, you're actually talking some real money. Except it's not real money. It's fiat currency. So, nonetheless, the weaponization of a contagious but highly non-lethal to anyone under 80 years old flu became the perfect camouflage of fear to bail out the teetering financial system and creating turmoil, chaos, and distrust among the populace. The non-stop fear-mongering was purposefully ramped to keep the public distracted, while the national wealth pillaging operation proceeded at a breakneck pace behind the scenes. $600 for you and $10 trillion for them. The monstrous effort to polarize the country by the psychopaths in suits, pulling the strings of societal disgruntlement, has the ultimate purpose of subjugation and dominion over every aspect of our lives. They no longer feel the need to conceal their treachery, as they openly proclaim their great reset, where you will own nothing and be happy. Living in a 200 square foot shipping container, eating synthetic meat, drinking Gates-endorsed reprocessed piss, snacking on bugs, and praying their windmill and solar power works on a calm, cloudy days as a frigid winter storm front arrives. Great little dystopia, right? None of this is an accident. It is not occurring naturally. This is a result of a designed blueprint to control and rule the world by a relatively small cadre of billionaire oligarch globalists, big tech despots, bought-off politicians, the banking cabal, fronted by their puppets at the Federal Reserve, surveillance state operatives, military-industrial complex parasites, captured corporate media, megacorporations, and mid-level government apparatchiks sucking on the teat of the deep state. These people are the real government who had been pulling the strings behind the curtain, but now feel emboldened to openly execute their plans, after observing how easily the masses could be manipulated and controlled through fear during the conveniently engineered pandemic. Decades of dumbing down the populace through government-run public school indoctrination disguised as education has produced millions of non-critical thinking, barely sentient consumers who have their beliefs fashioned, choices formed, and opinions dictated by manipulative men operating in the shadows. Those pulling the strings understand the psychological processes, societal relationships, and technology-driven social media addictions of the masses. They know how to sell a narrative based upon the emotions, feelings, fears, and biases of the masses. With so few capable of critical thinking and seeing through their deceptive manipulation of the storyline, complete control over mainstream and social media gives those pulling the strings tremendous power over the direction of society. And if they can keep the majority at each other's throats, distracted by trivialities, minutiae, false narratives, and unable to decipher the truth, they can keep us subjugated and constrained while they pilfer and pillage the wealth of the nation. It is a despicably audacious plan, but it is working to perfection. But, as always with humans, their hubris and myopia have convinced themselves they are infallible and immune to defeat. Their greed and arrogance will ultimately lead to their downfall. Sounds a little bit biblical, right? Pride always goeth before a fall. And boy howdy. Glenn Greenwald recently called out the faux journalists working in the corporate media complex for their shamefully pathetic attempt to twist the truth into the false narrative required by their deep state puppet masters. They are nothing but highly paid whores doing tricks at the behest of their oligarch pimps. Quote, if you think the real power centers in the U.S. are the Proud Boys, 4chan, and Boogaloos, rather than the CIA, FBI, NSA, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley, and spend most of your time battling the former while serving the latter as a stenographers, your journalism is definitionally shit. Quote by Glenn Greenwald. Real journalists like Greenwald and Tucker Carlson are not afraid to confront those shaking the societal jar. That is why there is a concerted effort by those shaking the jar to try and destroy Substack, where Greenwald writes, after The Intercept began to censor his articles, and to force Fox to cancel Carlson by pressuring advertisers to boycott his show. This cancel culture tactic is being employed by those in control to crush dissent and free speech, so their narrative can dominate the airwaves, and social media platforms drowning out the truth. There is a war for the soul of America underway, and only one side is fighting. The globalist cabal, along with their billionaire backers, Gates, Soros, Bloomberg, big tech tyrants, big media, big pharma, and big corporations. They have positioned their troops as attorneys generals, governors, mayors, and legislators, in universities, in K-12 classrooms, in the media, on Wall Street, at the Fed, and in the swamp of D.C. They now have a senile, useful idiot in the White House with a compliant, cackling diversity hire waiting in the wings to become their new stooge. A.K.A. hashtag Kamala Legs Up, Heels Up Harris. Yeah. The technique of using propaganda to manipulate the opinions of the masses put forth by Edward Bernays almost 100 years ago has been enhanced and perfected by the deceitful and traitorous psychopaths operating as the shadow government, as they purposefully construct false narratives and boogeymen, so they can expand their supremacy, dominion, and fortunes. It has always been this way, as human nature never changes. But the level and intensity has been ratcheted up to a degree never seen before in human history. Turn it up to 11, of course. Technological advances have allowed these evil men to reinforce their narrative while suppressing the truth tellers and brainwashing the masses to do as they are told. Over the last 5 to 10 years, they have convinced a vast swath of the population to believe utter nonsense, cower in their basements on command, and buy into false narratives and fake news that a 6th grade level IQ should be able to see through. I have never lived through the final days of an empire, but this must be how it feels. Those shaking the jar understand the mental processes of the ants because the indoctrination curriculum instilled in their brains by government-controlled public schools through sub-mediocre union-worshipping social justice warrior teachers has been designed to make them obedient, non-thinking, susceptible to psychological manipulation consumers. The controllers know which buttons to push to keep the masses at each other's throats. Democrat versus Republican, liberals versus conservatives, black versus white, male versus female, gay versus straight, young versus old, rich versus poor, capitalist versus socialist, white collar versus blue collar, essential versus non-essential, police versus citizens, military versus civilian, and numerous variations on these categories of warring factions. Below is only a partial list of false narratives, fake news, and outright lies over the last several years used by the powers that be to keep the ants fighting each other. The Russiagate conspiracy created by the Obama and Hillary acolytes in conspiracy with the leaders of the FBI, C_A, and DOJ to take down a duly elected president was a coup built upon nothing but lies, fomented and spread by the seditious corporate media. If the country were ruled by honest, forthright, law-abiding people, Obama, Hillary, Brennan, Clapper, Comey, and dozens of underlings would be in prison for this plot to unseat Trump. The Mueller investigation cost the American taxpayers tens of millions, produced thousands of hours of fake news reports by CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and the rest of the left-wing media, ruined the lives and reputations of dozens, distracted Trump from governing for 2 years, and resulted in absolutely zero proof of any wrongdoing or collusion with the Russians. The entire episode was created to distract from Hillary's emails, the murder of Seth Rich for providing the info to Julian Assange, and the filthy dealings of the Clinton Foundation. The lies about kids in cages and children being torn from the arms of their loving parents at the border, with photo shoots of AOC crying in an empty parking lot, was nothing but tripe. The cage pictures were taken during the Obama administration. It seems those cages are being used again, with Biden inviting millions to cross our unprotected border. But now, the narrative is one, humanity and caring. The hypocrisy of these feckless idiots knows no bounds. The fine people hoax regarding the Charlottesville protests and clashes in 2017 had been used by the Dems and their media mouthpieces for 3 years to make it appear Trump supported white supremacy. It was a complete and utter lie, and they knew it. Of course, the full airing of his real comments was played during the latest impeachment hoax, clearly vindicating Trump. But liberals still latch onto this false narrative like an infant with a bottle. The infantilization of the masses appears to be working, as a cry at every perceived microaggression. George Soros and his Open Society organization is intent on destroying all societal norms and community standards which have bound us together for generations. His desire is to destroy the family unit and replace it with the state. He openly funds anything and anyone who will further this agenda. He encourages things like drag queen story hour at public libraries, where purveyors of pedophilia freaks teach 5-year-olds how to twerk and attempt to legitimize their mental illness as normal. This brainwashing of children is child abuse. Soros has spent tens of millions to get sociopath district attorneys elected in Democrat-run urban shitholes, whose sole purpose is to encourage crime, not prosecute murderers and thieves, and allow havoc and chaos to engulf their cities. Mission accomplished, as murder rates have skyrocketed in every Democrat-run urban paradise in America, and the killing is not being committed by white supremacists. Soros is tearing down our society so it can be built back in his dystopian, communist vision of the future. The entire Jeffrey Epstein episode is another false narrative created by the jar shakers because they were the perverts, pedophiles, and deviants who Epstein was blackmailing with secret videotapes and whatever took place on his private island. Clinton, Gates, Dershowitz, Prince Andrew, John Roberts, and dozens more sociopaths were all implicated. Everyone knows Epstein did not kill himself. He was murdered by those at the top to shield themselves from revelations of their perversions and crimes. When you control the narrative, you can get away with anything. Maxwell will not talk. She knows her fate if she does. The faked chemical weapons attack in Syria, blamed on the Assad regime, was completely fabricated and staged. It resulted in President Trump launching a missile attack against the Syrian government. Everything reported by the corporate media over the last decade has been built upon lies. Obama created ISIS, with the support of McCain and the neocons, to overthrow the regime of Assad. They did such a bang-up job turning Libya from the richest country in Africa to a third-world ungovernable hellhole They wanted to accomplish the same in Syria. It was only after Putin's military began obliterating ISIS, the U.S. was shamed and reluctantly joined, and then took full credit for their defeat. Blaming Russia for everything bad that happens in our country, run by incompetent, corrupt boobs, has become the go-to lie by Dems and their media lapdogs of the Clown News, Washington Compost, New York Times, and MSDNC. They were accused of hacking into our electrical grid in 2016, with the entire story debunked in days. The Washington Compost claimed 200 websites had been infiltrated by the Russians, accusing Ron Paul and Tulsi Gabbard of being Russian assets. The laughability of these claims by Hillary's army did not stop useful idiots from believing. The Russians were accused of using sonic and microwave weapons to cause brain damage to U.S. personnel in the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. It was determined the sounds were male crickets during mating season. The bullshit continues to this day, as Biden has accused Putin of interfering in the 2020 election and calling him a killer. Maybe the Russians interfered to get Biden elected, knowing he is a dementia-racked, bumbling fool. The first ridiculous impeachment of Trump was based on a phone call with the Ukraine president regarding the actual corruption and payoffs to Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family to influence U.S. policy in the Ukraine. The U.S. had already funded and aided in the coup against the democratically elected president and encouraged the civil war that followed. The real crimes were committed by Hunter selling influence and the big guy having the Ukrainian prosecutor investigating Hunter fired. Ironically, two key figures in the impeachment hearings, Eric the Farter Swalwell and Diane the Crypt Keeper Feinstein, had much bigger skeletons in their closets, sleeping with a Chinese spy and employing a Chinese spy for almost 20 years as her driver. The second most ridiculous impeachment of Trump was such a shit show, John Roberts refused to participate in the farce. This travesty of justice was conducted to send a message to all Trump supporters: they will be painted with the brush of insurrectionists and white supremacists. The absurd charade was conducted after Trump was already out of office. Swalwell and his parade of woke jokes, doctored evidence, lied and exaggerated claims against Trump, and were ultimately eviscerated and embarrassed by Trump's defense team on national TV. But they convinced their faithful, intellectually deficient dupes Trump had provoked an armed insurrection, no matter the verdict. The false narrative of the January 6th armed insurrection is blatantly false and continues to be flogged by the dutifully deceptive defecators on the payroll of the Clown News and MSDNC. There is only one requirement for an armed insurrection. Somebody must be armed. Not one firearm was used by any of the selfie-taking boobs wandering around the Capitol. I guess someone could have been gored by the Buffalo dude. The fake news about a Capitol cop beaten to death with a fire extinguisher was peddled for months by the Clown News and MSDNC. It was 100% fake news. He died of a stroke a day after the protest. The only person killed was an unarmed female who posed no threat to anyone. They still have not revealed the name of the cop that executed her. The presence of Antifa plants, paid by the Clown News, instigating the crowd, has been memory holed by the malleable media. The armed insurrection by white supremacist false narrative has been exploited by the hateful shrew Pelosi to turn D.C. into an armed fortress, with National Guard members pretending to protect the Capitol from imminent attack by the Trump militia armies. The FBI does their part by fear-mongering about non-existent right-wing domestic terrorists, while Dem-run cities continue to be terrorized and burned by real Antifa and BLM terrorists, with federal buildings under armed attack and set on fire. The diversity hire Defense Secretary is busy purging white Trump supporters from the ranks, while encouraging the feminization of his forces, to the delight of Russia and China. Pelosi and Schumer will never tear down those walls. They know their far-left agenda will ultimately result in chaos and revolution. They want to extinguish our existing civilization so they can build back better. As a globalist utopia where the few, like Gates, Soros, and Schwab, rule over the many, and you will own nothing and be happy, or else. The false narrative they have been beating to death since the election is a QAnon conspiracy of a vast array of right-wing domestic terrorists planning a takeover of the government. They were blamed for the January 6th non-insurrection and are being used as the excuse to keep 12-foot walls around the Capitol. This entire storyline is laughable, except brainless twits in the corporate media flog it to benefit Pelosi and her parade of congressional dimwits as they intentionally mislead the public about the real threats in this country. If 5% of Trump voters had ever heard of QAnon, I would be shocked. If 0.00001% of the public believed the fairy tales spun on 4chan or 8chan or whatever chan, then I would be flabbergasted. In retrospect, it is evident that this was a psyop conducted by the surveillance state to lure people into a trap of hope, and now is being used to paint all Trump supporters as crazy white supremacists, intent on overthrowing the government. Mission accomplished by the jar shakers. And in part 2 of this article, I will detail the extraordinary efforts by those in power to cover up the ultimately fatal levels of debt endangering the American empire, by creating trillions more in debt and pondering what happens next on our road to perdition. So there you go. That is part 1. I'm sure you guys can probably think of a few more scenarios aside from those just read, but some of the highlights in that over the last 4 years of Trump being in office. I'm sure we probably could have expounded on the January 6th stuff to include, the FBI going after various vets and shaking them down and causing great consternation and everything else. Plenty of that going on. Let's see here. So to part 2. So again, Jim Quinn continues in part 2. Who is shaking the jar? Off his Burning Platform blog here. In part 1 of this article, I documented the never-ending false narratives used by those shaking the jar to keep us at each other's throats. I will now show how 2020 was a turning point in history, with an accelerating decline of our empire in progress. A nation of sheep ruled by wolves and owned by pigs. The numerous examples of how those holding the jar shake it to generate conflict and chaos to achieve their Machiavellian ambitions pales in comparison with what they accomplished during the fateful year of 2020. They began shaking the jar at hypersonic speed by weaponizing the annual flu, giving it a scary name, and then faking data to scare the entire world into lockdowns and mandatory masking, even though science said neither of these solutions worked against viruses. And the science was right. But that was not enough. They needed to reignite race wars by declaring the country is infected with systematic racism, even though we have spent $25 trillion on welfare programs since the war on poverty began in 1965. The level of shaking in 2020 should make any critical thinking person pause and ask why. They really needed a huge distraction as cover for their real purpose. As usual, just follow the money. The global financial system was on life support and was in danger of flatlining, destroying the wealth of billionaire oligarchs, corporate titans, and the Wall Street cabal. And of course, one might surmise that it still is, because, again, as I highlighted here, and I'm digressing briefly, that there is so much floating around that the Fed has pumped out that they've literally run out of assets to try and plug these things into and now have to make up new stuff. Instead of corporations and whatnot, or startup companies net dumping into IPOs, initial product offerings, you have these things called SPACs now. Basically blank checks by financiers behind the scenes who will just, front the money for you to start something. Don't even have to look at what your game plan is. Don't care if you lose money. Don't care if you're like Netflix, lose money, whatever. No problem. And then, of course, you've got these new tools net to dump money in called NFTs, non-fungible tokens, yes. A totally new asset, just whipped up out of thin air, kind of like our money. So there you go. That's what's going on in the world of finance these days. Says what appears to be happening is the last dying gasps of an empire of debt, as it thrashes about using an unconstitutional means to control its subjects, while injecting trillions of fiat dollars as an adrenaline treatment for a terminal cancer diagnosis. As a last resort, initiating a global war with Russia and China would certainly distract the masses and keep them from realizing the true enemy within. Turning Washington, D.C. into an armed encampment is not to protect the government from white supremacists. It is to protect the traitorous creatures in Congress and the White House from the citizens when this diabolical plan blows up in our faces. Inflation is already raging, but the government and Fed tell you it is only 1.5%. There are 261 million working-age Americans and only 127 million are employed full-time. But the government tells you the unemployment rate is 6.2%, when more than 50% of those capable of working are not. The government will tell you GDP soared in the first quarter at 6%, when we are in the midst of a government-created depression, and the GDP calculation is nothing more than the government borrowing trillions from future generations and giving a minuscule portion to current generations, with the vast majority going into the pockets of billionaire oligarchs, Wall Street, and megacorporations. The economic recovery narrative is entirely false, but the jar shakers know the plebes do not understand math. Welcome to Common Core Math. Yeah, GDP, all that good stuff, totally farcical. Plus any calculations. We know the whole damn thing has been rigged from the start. Manipulation of stock prices by the dip. LIBOR, you name it. Every single aspect has been raped and pillaged and rigged. The plumbing of our astonishingly crooked financial system began to fail in September 2019, with overnight repo rates soaring to 10%. The Fed immediately leapt into action by restarting QE, aka No Banker Left Behind, to keep the depth of our debt predicament hidden from the public. A flu released from a Chinese biolab, which is highly non-lethal to anyone under 80 years old, has been utilized by the jar shakers to unleash a tsunami of digital fiat, aka debt, to prop up a system being smothered by too much debt. Since March of 2020, our beloved legislators have added 4.5 trillion to the national debt, a 20% increase in 1 year. The Fed has done their part by jolting their balance sheet up by 3.5 trillion, an 85% increase in 1 year. The current administration is saying, "Hold my beer," as they are busy adding another 4 trillion in the next year, and the Fed will add another 2 trillion or so to their balance sheet. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of small businesses have been permanently destroyed, while Bezos and the rest of his billionaire buddies have increased their net worth by tens of billions. At least your grandma's earning 0.015% in her savings account, while her living expenses rise by 10%. Do you get it yet? Yeah. And of course they say that inflation is only 1.5%. Really? How do you explain lumber prices lately? How do you explain steel prices? Copper prices? Anything else? Oh, food prices, coffee prices, anything that's gone through the Suez Canal right now. Fuel prices? Oh, I guess we're just supposed to not believe our eyes, right? What our eyes tell us? 1.5% my ass. Says in this cycle, the Fed's balance sheet will expand by more than during QE1, 2, and 3 combined. QE1 started back in 2008 when we had our initial little hiccup back then, and it's gone up precipitously since then. The COVID hysteria is a narrative that only comes along once in a century, and the jar shakers could not let this manufactured crisis go to waste. They're still milking it for everything they can. As Fauci warns of variants and whatever other gibberish designed to keep the masses frightened, obedient, and compliant. The entire narrative is built upon falsity, misinformation, fear, fake data, and censorship, all to benefit big pharma profits, increase government control, and initiate the Great Reset. CDC guidelines, dozens of other scientific studies, and even the warning on every box of surgical masks confirmed masks do not protect you from viruses. It says right on the side of the doggone box, folks. N95s, right there on the side. Look it up. Fauci, head of CDC, and the Surgeon General were not lying in March 2020 when they said masks do not protect you and should not be worn. They do not protect you from anything, and all the data proves mask mandates did nothing to stop the spread. A virus is going to virus. The case counts skyrocketed in the winter when masks were being worn by 90% of the public. But as far as jar shaking, masks are the gift that keeps giving, as a mask-worshipping cult attack non-maskers as granny killers. Those with the common sense to realize masks are worthless theater and virtue signaling are scorned, ridiculed, and ostracized by the ignorant maskers who believe everything they are told on the boob tube by self-proclaimed medical experts. Wearing a mask gives mental weaklings a purpose in life. Masks were determined by those in control to be an ideal method of control and source of conflict to keep the plebes at each other's throats. And it continues. Despite unequivocal proof, masks are useless. The lockdowns of the world by politicians following the direction of healthcare expert models has proved to be the absolute worst decision since the leaders of Europe thought the conflict started in July 1914 would be over in a few weeks. It is now clear the lockdowns were used as the main lever to undermine our democratic elections and remove Trump from office. The virus and lockdowns were used by the deep state to ensure victory in November with an onslaught of fraudulent mail-in ballots in Democrat-controlled swing states and cities. The lockdowns were also exploited by the jar shakers to destroy small businesses and shift the revenues to mega corporations like Amazon, Walmart, and Target. The destruction of the last vestiges of free market capitalism occurred in 2020, as the government, in collusion with the Federal Reserve, picked the economic winners, them, and losers, you. Decided whether you were essential, redistributed wealth from the poor to the rich, set us on a path toward socialism, and laid the groundwork for the Great Reset. And of course, the old quote from Mr. Klaus Schwab himself, "The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world." The lockdowns did not slow mitigate, or stop the spread of the virus in any way. They tell us to trust the science, but the masking and lockdowns were futile, destructive, and worthless. The rise and fall of cases followed the exact trajectory in states that locked down heavily, New York, California, Michigan, versus those that barely locked down or did not lock down at all, Florida, Georgia, South Dakota. They did not have more deaths per capita than the lockdown states while not destroying their economy and the lives of their citizens. The untold psychological damage to our children and their educational regression can never be reversed. But these totalitarian governors, Cuomo, Newsom, Whitmer, Wolf, Murphy, continue to act like despots, inflicting their arbitrary, non-scientific-based rules, regulations, and mandates on the people who have been propagandized into submission by the jar shakers. Dissenters like the owners of Attila's Gym in New Jersey and the Polish restaurant owner in Michigan are publicly tortured by the authorities with massive fines and jail time for attempting to keep their small businesses alive. How dare you? But it is safe to stand in line with 300 people at Costco on a Saturday. The hypocrisy of these slimy politicians is capsulized in the picture of Newsom dining indoors at the most exclusive restaurant in California at $1,200 a plate, while his subjects were locked in their homes. Perhaps that's why he may be getting recalled at the moment. The truth is, you have a 99.7% chance of not dying from this virus, even if you contract it. Those are the facts as presented by the CDC, not conspiracy theorists. And based on the number of reported cases in the last year, you only had about a 10% chance of catching it. So your risk level is infinitesimal. It is less lethal than the annual flu to those under 50 years old. If you are on death's doorstep and your governor sticks infected patients into your nursing home, you're probably going to die with COVID, not from COVID. According to how they have classified other deaths, George Floyd died of COVID, not the fentanyl overdose that really killed him. The jar shakers needed high death counts to invoke fear and obedience, so they paid hospitals a bounty for all COVID-classified deaths. Fauci, Gates, and their big pharma cohorts needed huge case counts and deaths to fast-track their gene-altering therapy, disguised as a vaccine. The solution was to ramp up testing to over 1 million tests per day to generate hundreds of thousands of false positives and report them as cases. It worked like a charm, as the experimental fast-track therapies will generate over $4 billion of profits for Pfizer in the first year, with billions more to come because we will be told it requires an annual booster shot. Those in power are pushing, prodding, and propagandizing the masses to do their duty and get the jabs. An all-out media blitz of Hollywood stars and sports heroes are paraded before cameras getting the jab. Of course, Hank Aaron and Marvin Hagler are not able to do follow-up appearances. The mainstream media and social media tyrants have been tasked with suppressing any information about adverse reactions and deaths from the jab. The censorship of studies proving ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine were highly effective in alleviating the symptoms of COVID by the Silicon Valley suppression sycophants resulted in the deaths of people who could have been saved. But these two safe drugs with a long history of success are extremely cheap, costing a few dollars per treatment. Big Pharma does not benefit, so Gates' profits would evaporate, and Fauci would not get his position on the Pfizer board after writing his book about saving the world. Or his children's propaganda book that he recently apparently kicked out. Sick. The most worrisome aspect of this whirlwind of vaccination propaganda is the complete disinterest among the masses about possible long-term side effects. A critical thinking individual should be worried the big pharma companies required the waiver of all liability for whatever unpleasant or lethal side effects their experimental gene therapies might inflict on unsuspecting dupes. With Mr. Population Control Gates heavily invested in these vaccines, a conspiracy theorist like me wonders whether there is an ulterior motive to this mass vaccination assault for a flu with a 99.7% survival rate. Does the vaccine increase my odds of survival to 99.8%? And at what cost? Have you been lied to, misled, or misinformed by these leaders and experts in the last year? As if the mandatory masking, lockdowns, and vaccine propaganda did not provide enough jar shaking in 2020, the controllers thought a nice race war would further facilitate their master plan of societal destruction, laying the groundwork for their Build Back Better Great Reset. The entirely false narrative of systemic racism was rolled out after the death of an out-of-control felon high on fentanyl based on a partial video of a cop restraining him with a standard operating procedure technique, and the death of a former EMT whose boyfriend was a drug dealer who opened fire on police as they entered their apartment. These two dicey characters were elevated to sainthood by the professional race-baiting hucksters, and the Dem-controlled urban ghettos exploded in riots, looting and burning of businesses. Nothing reflects protesting systematic racism like stealing a 65-inch HD TV from Target in honor of George Floyd. After his 6 funerals and corporate America latching onto the anti-racism theme with the media stirring the hate and vitriol, the entire summer was spent watching our cities burn at the hands of Antifa and BLM terrorists, funded by Soros. White Americans watched this travesty play out on TV every night, wondering why the police were instructed by Dem mayors to stand down as their cities burned and businesses were destroyed. Meanwhile, we were inundated with messages on TV informing all white people they are inherently racist, as corporations and universities bended the knee to this utter bullshit. The critical race theory nonsense and 1619 Project lies were pushed by fake news peddler academics and the usual suspects like Sharpton. Athletes making millions taking the knee during the national anthem to protest systemic racism was laughable. Canceling anyone who failed to bow down before these race baiters became the cool thing to do among the low IQ liberal set. And it continues today unabated because there are too many cowardly white people unwilling to push back on the lies for fear of losing their jobs. Those controlling the narrative know they are winning, so they have moved into Dr. Seuss and Pepe Le Pew as the next step in destroying any remaining societal cohesion. The gender identity crap is also being ratcheted up to shake the jar and create mayhem and hatred. To what end? When you are the midst of a whirling dust storm of lies, misinformation, and relentless propaganda, it is tough to rise above it all to decipher what is really happening and who is telling the truth. From my perspective, I see an empire in a death throes that doesn't realize it's dying. Everything happening from the desperate financial measures being employed by central bankers to the extreme political measures being inflicted upon the populace, the military actively participating in domestic issues and being used by politicians against citizens, the purposeful tearing of the social fabric by traitorous globalist forces, and the shredding of constitutional rights with no dissent from a feckless judicial branch are unambiguous signs of an empire in decline. I believe the powerful oligarchs realize what is happening and are attempting to engineer a controlled demolition so they can build back better without sacrificing their wealth, clout, and hegemony over the masses. Their goal is for you to own nothing and be happy. And if you disagree, sometime in the gulag will change your attitude. The unraveling of civilization we are experiencing was already underway, but has been purposefully accelerated by the jar shakers over the last year to create the environment for a great reset. I strongly doubt the ability of these arrogant, narcissistic psychopaths to engineer a controlled demolition of an empire without creating a chaotic financial collapse in conjunction with a global conflagration. Historian Neil Ferguson observed all great powers have risen and fallen, usually over a lengthy time frame. Quote here says, "Great powers, like great men, are born, rise, reign, and then gradually wane. No matter whether civilizations decline culturally, economically, or ecologically, their downfalls are protracted." Ferguson then pondered whether modernity could create the conditions for a rapid decline. What if the speed of the modern world also translates into the speed of declines? Ferguson understands any grain of sand falling on an unstable portion of the sand pile can lead to a catastrophic collapse. What if collapse does not arrive over a number of centuries, but comes suddenly, like a thief in the night? Great powers are complex systems. These comes a moment when complex systems go critical. A very small trigger can set off a phase transition from a benign equilibrium to a crisis. A single grain of sand causes a whole pile to collapse. Lack of courage, political corruption, excessive greed, extreme levels of debt, decadence, social decay, technological addiction, and consumerism has left our country teetering on the brink of disaster. Ferguson assesses the facts and concludes, collapse of the American empire is closer than most people think. Most imperial falls are associated with fiscal crises. Alarm bells should therefore be ringing very loudly for the United States. A complex adaptive system is in big trouble when its component parts lose faith in its viability. Empires behave like all complex adaptive systems. They function in apparent equilibrium for some unknowable period, and then, quite abruptly, they collapse. The jar shakers have been lulled into a false sense of security, as their non-stop efforts to foment discontent and create conflict among the ants has yielded tremendous success. What if the ants realized the real enemy was holding the jar, and decided to combine forces and attack the true enemy with venomous poison? The real enemy has emerged from the shadows. Those 12-foot walls, barbed wire, and armed military personnel around the Capitol signify we are already the subjects of a military junta semi-dictatorship. They fear their citizens because they know what they are doing is designed to destroy the last remnants of a once proud republic. The totalitarian measures implemented at all levels of government in the last year were a test run to see how far they could push you. They are now convinced you will not push back because you have not pushed back. The moment has arrived to regain our courage, fortitude, love for country, community standards, traditions, and moral code. The path we are on is one of destruction, decay, and servitude to powerful men who do not have your best interests at heart. The future appears bleak, but we are descended from rebels and dissenters. Our descent into darkness is not a foregone conclusion. The current path should be unacceptable to any citizen who cares about future unborn generations. It is time to fight for your country. It is not, if not now, then when? The enemy has revealed themselves. Do whatever you can to thwart their agenda. Our forefathers faced greater odds. Here in America, we are descended in blood and in spirit from revolutionists and rebels, men and women who dare to dissent from accepted doctrine. As their heirs, may we never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion. Quote via Dwight D. Eisenhower. The corrupt establishment will do anything to suppress sites like these, the burning platform from revealing the truth. And of course, like I said, this article brought to us by Jim Quinn over at the Burning Platform. So, there you have it. Part 2 of Who is Shaking the Jar. Drop that link out there. You guys can take a peek at that as well. So he's absolutely right at the end of the day. You know, biblically speaking, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. We don't wrestle against our neighbors, per se. Right? At the end of the day, there are forces greater than we can see in our realms that are shaking the jar. There are some that we know, yes, as they cite the Soroses, the Gates, the Rockefellers, the whoever's that sit atop, whoever you may wish them to be, Trilateral Commission, you name it, any one of the other agencies and the like. Doesn't matter. It's all the same at the end of the day. None have our best interests in mind. At the end of the day, the government is not going to reform itself. It is going to come down to we, the people, period. And at the same time, you better be prepared for what is coming. Obviously, if you're paying attention to what has been going on worldwide economically, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, commodity prices up. If you believe that 1.5% inflation BS, well, I got some beachfront property to sell you, and a state that doesn't border water. But nonetheless, pay attention. Keep your eyes on. Head on a swivel. The Suez Canal, that's going to have some long-term implications. And of course, many of us will probably realize even after Biden got in office, per se, took the office, seated himself, was put in place, whatever way you want to look at it. Gas prices, where have they gone since? Up. How do things get from point A to B? Transported via what? Fuel. Fuel prices go up. Means all the consumables go up along with it. Alright, so last but not least, try to end a little bit on a high note here. As I said, Leviathan is kind of the theme here tonight. Mises Institute had this to say. It says the never-ending battle between Leviathan and liberty. Good little article by James Bovard over there. Says the notion that Americans will always be free is part of the catechism that is force-fed to public school students. For hundreds of years, philosophers, politicians, and reformers have touted a law of history that assures the ultimate triumph of freedom. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his famous letter from Birmingham jail. But few political follies are more hazardous than presuming that one's liberties are forever safe. None of the arguments on why liberty is inevitable can explain why it has not yet arrived. Most of the human race existed with little or no freedom for 95% of recorded history. If liberty is God's gift to humanity, then why were most people who ever lived on earth denied this divine bequest? Many efforts at limiting state power have failed almost immediately. In the 13th century, oppressed English nobles revolted and sought to bind their kings to perpetuity. King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, petulantly accepting a limit to his prerogative to pillage everything in his domain. While the Magna Carta is celebrated nowadays as the dawn of a new age, it failed to even bind the king who signed the document. The ink on his signature was barely dry before King John brought in foreign forces and proceeded to slaughter the barons who forced his signature. King John died just after his vengeance commenced, providing a respite for Englishmen. In the final realm, the Magna Carta was simply a political pledge that was honored only insofar as private courage and weaponry compelled sovereigns to limit their abuses. History is a chronology of nations pillaged by reckless regimes. English kings recited coronation oaths that limited their powers. Such oaths were as binding as a congressional candidate's campaign promises. Rampaging kings sometimes converted smoldering discontent into a raging fire of resistance. Historian Thomas Macaulay summarized England's path to its glorious revolution of 1688 Oppression speedily did what philosophy and eloquence failed to do. King James II was ousted in 1688, and Parliament speedily enacted laws to curb all subsequent monarchs. The United States was the first government to be created with strict limitations on its power, enshrined in the Constitution. As James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. The founders included numerous checks and balances in the Constitution to restrain political ambition. But they were never so naive as to presume that a parchment barrier would keep American liberty safe in perpetuity. Within the first decade of the nation's existence, Congress and President John Adams enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which destroyed freedom of the press and speech. Thomas Jefferson responded by writing a resolution in 1799 that warned, "Free government is founded in jealousy, not confidence. In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in men, but bind him down from mischief by the chain of the Constitution." Senator John Taylor, in his 1821 book Tyranny Unmasked, scoffed at presuming our good theoretical system of government is a sufficient security against actual tyranny. Those chains of the Constitution have often been illusory, or merely a placebo phantasm for government victims. Politicians perennially invoke the Constitution to prove that citizens have no reason to fear the government. When the House of Representatives considered the Patriot Act in October 2001, Representative James Sensenbrenner, out of Wisconsin, assured fellow members of Congress that the bill does not do anything to take away the freedoms of innocent citizens. Of course, we all recognize that the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution prevents the government from conducting unreasonable searches and seizures, and that is why this legislation does not change the United States Constitution or the rights guaranteed to citizens of this country. Sensenbrenner talked as if that the mere existence of the Bill of Rights shackled Congress. This is akin to claiming that because automobiles have brakes, drivers can never exceed the speed limit. The Patriot Act unleashed a constitutional crime wave, as the Bush administration suspended habeas corpus and conducted waves of secret arrests, unleashed the FBI to conduct hundreds of thousands of warrantless searches, and entitled the National Security Agency to vacuum up Americans' emails and other personal data. American presidents take an oath of office to solemnly swearing to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. But this has long been an empty ritual, akin to Roman emperors making public sacrifices to pagan gods they knew did not exist. Fealty to the Constitution has evaporated in part because philosophical trends have long favored absolute power. Intellectual servility has been perennially profitable, and there has never been a shortage of writers exalting supreme rulers. Writing in 1651, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes labeled the state as Leviathan, our mortal god. Leviathan signifies a government whose power is unbounded, with a right to dictate almost anything and everything to the people under its sway. While Hobbes was reviled in the first century after his book was published, his ideas later became fashionable as academics rushed to echo his derision of tyrannophobia. Hobbes declared that it is forever prohibited for subjects in any way to speak evil of their sovereign, regardless of how badly they are abused. Hobbes often suicide pact sovereignty. To recognize a government's existence is to automatically concede the government's right to destroy everything in its domain. Hobbes profoundly influenced subsequent political philosophers, including German philosophers G. W. F. Hegel, who trumpeted the doctrine that history is the actualization of freedom. But Hegel was not using freedom in the sense that the founding fathers did. Instead, Hegel declared the state in and for itself is the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom. Hegel also proclaimed that the state is a divine idea as it exists on earth, and derided the notion of freedom as individual choice, as uneducated and superficiality. Hegel's Slavish version of freedom was difficult to distinguish from Hobbes' totalitarian vision of sovereignty. Hegel had a profound influence on communism via Marx, fascism, and on the most popular philosopher in Washington in recent decades. Francis Fukuyama, a State Department functionary, hailed Hegel as the supreme philosopher of freedom. In 1989, Fukuyama proclaimed the unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism and boasted that we in the West, liberal West, occupy the final summit of the historical edifice. He announced the end of history as such, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Fukuyama's law of history supposedly proved that government was no longer a threat to freedom. By making political power appear innocuous, Fukuyama became an instant hero inside the Beltway. Fukuyama's end of history revelation was zealously embraced by the political media establishment. Fukuyama provided a law of history that supposedly negated all the warnings from history about political power. Fukuyama's doctrine liberated presidents in the name of freedom. In his 2002 national security strategy, President George W. Bush echoed Fukuyama's view. The great struggles of the 20th century between liberty and totalitarianism ended with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom and a single sustainable model for national success: freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. At a 2002 Republican fundraiser dinner, Bush declared, "We will do whatever it takes to make the homeland secure and to make freedom reign across the world." In his 2005 inaugural address, Bush whooped, "We go forward with complete confidence in the eventual triumph of freedom." Bush used freedom Bosch to sanctify his wars, torture regime, and militaristic threats against any foreign regime that disobeyed Washington. Why would history stop after either liberty or democracy is achieved? The experience of many countries has been one person, one vote, one time. Faith in democracy as a perpetual guarantor of freedom is tricky to reconcile with the collapse of more than 30 democracies around the globe in recent years. Few of the democracies that have survived have fastidiously respected citizens' rights. Some libertarians are confident that, despite post-9/11 debacles, liberty will inevitably triumph in the end. But why would freedom be safer in the future than now? Because of a law of history that was never enacted by God, a convocation of cardinals, or even the Arkansas state legislature? Presuming that America or any other nation is destined to be free lulls people against potential oppressors. Author Robert Anton Wilson observed, "Every national border in Europe marks a place where two gangs of bandits got too exhausted to kill each other anymore and signed a treaty." Similarly, the current extent of government powers marks the boundary of political onslaughts into the private domain of liberty. There will be no perpetual truce along this border because political marauders will continually create new pretexts to invade citizens' lives. The private domain relies primarily on voluntary agreements, independence, and peaceful coexistence. The political domain relies on command and control, subjugation, and threats and penalties. One of the greatest perils to the private domain is the notion that Leviathan is more legitimate than liberty. Downplaying government coercion is the key to this propaganda coup. For most of the American media, compelling submission to political commands is a non-issue, equivalent of the sun rising in the east each morning. At this time, when political power began soaring in the 1930s, American political thinking systematically disregarded the danger from government. In the 1940s, as Professor David Siepley observed, the state was dropped from American social science as part of the reaction to the rise of totalitarianism. All traces of state autonomy, now understood as state coercion, were expunged from the image of American democracy. Siepley explained that the emergence of Hitler and Stalin as the ultimate social engineers led American political scientists to fall silent about all such activities in the American governmental system. If totalitarianism means elite social engineering, then American democracy must mean popular control. Democracy became the purported champion of freedom because people were taught that democracies were inherently non-oppressive. But as Senator John Taylor warned 2 centuries ago, self-government is flattered to destroy self-government. For many people, liberty is an abstraction until government agents ravage their lives. A lucid recognition of the coercive nature of Leviathan is vital for the defense of freedom. Leviathan's abuses and atrocities must be weaponized to awaken as many people as possible to the perils they face. Legitimacy spawns a political fog that obscures people's recognition of their own victimhood. Lenin reputedly said that capitalists would sell communists the rope with which the capitalists were hanged. Similarly, Leviathan perennially provides ample gunpowder for detonating its legitimacy. Leviathan, without legitimacy, is simply a regime that must rely on brute force to compel submission to its decrees. At some point, the brute force becomes too great for regime lackeys to cover up. Once legitimacy is lost, governments can collapse like overheated soufflés. For instance, East Bloc regimes imploded much faster than almost anyone expected. Prior to 1989, Soviet leaders believed that cosmetic reforms would keep people subdued despite a failing economic system. CIA analysts predicted that 100+ million people in East Europe would remain docile and downtrodden for decades longer. But proliferating protests in several nations spurred the Hungarian government to permit a breach in the Iron Curtain along the Austrian border in May 1989. That breach quickly spurred a flood of humanity rushing to escape communism, taking with them the tattered remnants of regime's legitimacy. 6 months later, the Berlin Wall was breached and government fell like dominoes. On Christmas Day, Romanian soldiers celebrated by lining their dictator and his wife up in front of a stone wall and executing them. Most contemporary governments have more popular support than Soviet bloc regimes received in the 1980s, but sustained abuses can be an acid drip that eventually topples any government regardless of its purposed mandate. More Americans believe in witches, ghosts, and astrology nowadays than trust the federal government. In the COVID-19 era, America is degenerating into a cage-keeper democracy, where voters merely select the politicians who place them under house arrest. Expecting liberty to permanently triumph would require rulers to miraculously become selfless, if not self-sacrificing. But as Hayek warned in his essay, Why the Worst Get on Top, power is a magnet for the dregs of humanity. Faith in the state will continue reviving as long as some people feel entitled to domineer other people. Political action pays a higher premium on deceit than almost any other human activity, and thus will remain perilous to everything decent. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, as our forefathers recognized in the 19th century. To presume that liberty is inevitable is to absolve oneself from fighting oppression. As soon as people drop the reins on government, politicians will leash the people. Rather than hoping for an end of history triumph, people must battle forever to defend their rights. As long as individuals continue to defy oppressors, the seeds of resistance will produce bountiful harvests of freedom and better times. There you go. Little read from James Bovard on Liberty versus the Leviathan, again out of the Mises Institute here. Always like articles like that to pull in some of the stuff from our founding fathers and grab bits and pieces of history into that because, as you all know, folks, there is nothing new under the sun. This has all been done before. It's the same pattern over and over again. You might as well call it playbook and kill box because it's the same. Just that we have better technology now, perhaps. But the fight is the same. At the end of the day, you gotta stand up every day and defend what you have lest somebody take it. Period. Every day, that's a fight. And to the end, we do fight. We'll fight. All right. Let's see here. Been going here for a little bit, so. No, I didn't take a hit off a joint. What the hell? A little sip of the old coffee here. Come on now. Let's see. So, Sunday, we should be here, I believe, for our roundtable as per usual, if not sooner. Right here on the 5x5 channel. Obviously, you can check out my material for those that follow. I just did a follow-up piece here in the last couple days on some COVID-19 updates pertaining to masks, which we touched a bit upon here in some of the articles here this evening. If you go over to my YouTube channel, I did put the montage and that out there. Put little tunes to that as well. You guys can check that out. I use that as a bit of a red pill tool, if you so desire. Collection of about 4 months worth of nothing but mask-related articles and that from around the old webosphere. So you can check that out. But otherwise, yeah, I think that'll do it for tonight. Appreciate you guys tuning in, as always, right here for another fireside chat. We'll have some more of these coming up soon. Obviously, the Easter season is upon us. Palm Sunday, all that good stuff here. So be well. We'll see you back here shortly. Take care. God bless everybody.